Good morning. Today we are going to talk about Heckscher Ohlin model. There are a number of criticisms for the classical trade model. Number one, the model doesn't explain why differences in productivity levels between countries. We tell that country A has an advantage in the production, whether absolute or comparative advantage in the production of X or Y, as workers in country A take 3 hours in order to produce a unit of the commodity, for example. But we don't explain why. Why country A takes only 3 hours while country B takes, for example, 5 hours. So why there's a difference? So number one, the model doesn't explain why differences in productivity level between countries exist. Number two, the model is based on unrealistic assumptions, as the model assumes that there is a complete specialization, but actually in real life there is no complete specialization. Each country is going to produce the two commodities, but will specialize or produce more from one of them. So it is based on unrealistic assumptions. Number three, it maintains that benefits from trade are greater between countries with dissimilar technologies. So these are the main criticisms of the classical trade model. As a result, Heckscher and Ohlin, two economists, tried to find a more realistic model, a more realistic explanation why countries trade with each other and what are the benefits from trade. So they have introduced two new concepts: factor endowments and factor intensity. Factor endowment is related to the country, while factor intensity is related to the industry. Referring back to our example that we have to our assumption that we have two countries, A and B. According to the classical theory, there is only one relevant factor of production, which is labor. But according to Heckscher Ohlin model, each country has two main factors of production: capital and labor. And we would like to compare which one of them has more capital, which one of them has more labor. But according to assumption number 2, that we have to rely on the relative value, not the absolute one. So we have to compare capital labor ratio in country A and capital labor ratio in country B. If it is greater, the ratio is greater in country A to country B, then country A is said to country A is capital abundant. Capital abundant means that it has more capital than labor. It has more capital labor ratio compared to the other country than labor. And we are going to do the same with respect to labor in order to identify which country is labor abundant. What about factor intensity? Factor intensity, as we said, is related to industry. From assumption number 1, that we have two countries, each one of them produces two commodities, textile and soybeans. The production of textile requires capital and labor, and also the production of soybeans requires capital and labor. So we would like to know which one of them requires more labor capital ratio or more capital labor ratio. So we have to compare capital labor ratio for textile. This is the quantity required to produce a single unit of textile. And capital labor ratio for soybeans. If capital labor ratio for textile is greater than capital labor ratio for soybeans, then textile is capital intensive industry. So when we are going to talk about the country, it is abundant. When we are going to talk about the industry, it is intensive. So let's take an example. This is the quantity available of capital and labor in each country. It can be in million or in thousands, whatever. So country A has 3 units or 3,000 units of capital and 6,000 units of labor. And country B, 5,000 of capital and 4,000 of labor. We would like to identify which country is capital abundant and which one of them is labor abundant. So we have to compare capital labor ratio in country A and in country B. In country A, it will be 3/6, which is half. and in country B 5/4, which is 1.25. So which one of them has more capital labor ratio? Country B. So country B is capital abundant. And we are going to do the same with respect to labor. It's labor capital ratio in country A, and we are going to compare it to labor capital ratio in country B. So it will be 6/3, 2, and 4/5. So country A has more labor. So country A is labor abundant. This is the quantity of labor and the capital required to produce a single unit of soybeans and a single unit of textile. Say, for example, soybeans, the production of soybeans requires 5 units of capital and 10 units of labor. And the production of textile requires 5 units of labor and 5 units of capital. So which one of them is labor intensive and which one of them is capital intensive? So we have to calculate capital labor ratio for soybeans and capital labor ratio for textile. It will be 5 divided by 10, which is half, and 5 divided by 5, which is 1. We are going to do the same with respect, So textile requires more capital in its production compared to soybeans. So textile is capital intensive industry. We are going to do the same for labor capital ratio instead of capital labor ratio. So it will be labor capital ratio for soybeans and labor capital ratio for textile. It's 10/5, which is 2, and 5/5, which is 1. So production of soybeans requires more labor compared to production of textile. So soybeans is labor intensive industry. So which country will specialize in the production of textile? As we said, textile is capital intensive, which means its production needs more capital. And country B is capital abundant, which means it has a huge amount of capital compared to labor. So country B will specialize in the production of textile. The same with respect to soybeans. Soybeans requires more labor in its production. And country A is labor abundant, which means it has more labor than country B. As a result, country A will specialize in the production of soybeans. Heckscher and Ohlin retains the first 10 assumptions of the classical model and drops assumption number 11 and number 12, where assumption number 11 states that labor is the only relevant factor of production, but in our case, we have labor and capital. So in this case, labor is not going to be the only relevant one. And assumption number 12, which states that there is a constant return to scale, but actually it's not going to be constant anymore. And according to Heckscher and Ohlin, they are going to add 5 more assumptions, so that the total number of assumptions for Heckscher and Ohlin, they are 15 assumptions. The first 10 of the classical trade model, in addition to 5 more assumptions. Number 13. There are 2 factors of production, labor and capital. Where labor earns wages and capital owner earns rental payment. Number 2, or number 14, technologies available for both countries are identical, which means that the only factor that affects the decision whether to produce capital or whether to produce soybeans or textile is the amount of capital and labor required and available in each country and in each industry. Number 15, the production of textile in both countries requires more labor per capita. Which means that textile is labor intensive industry. So if you are going to compare labor capital ratio in case of textile compared to labor capital ratio for soybeans, it's gonna be greater for textile. Number 16, countries differ in their endowments of factors of production, which means that one of them has more labor and the other one has more capital in order to have an advantage and make an exchange of goods and services. And in order to be able to draw the graph and find the general equilibrium, we are going to assume that country A is capital abundant, which means that capital labor ratio in country A is greater than capital labor ratio in country B. This means As we said before, that labor earns wages and the capital rental payment. If a country has a huge amount of any product, or if a supplier supplies more of a product, then the price of this product is going to decrease. This is the same with respect to capital and labor. As capital in country A is greater than in country B, so rental payment in country A is going to be less than rental payment in country B. As countries differ in their endowment of factors of production, this can be illustrated graphically by a concave PPF instead of in a straight line PPF. So this assumption means that we are going to deal with a concave BPF in a straight line instead of a straight line BPF. And finally, with respect to assumption number 17, tests are identical in both countries. Which means that CIC is identical or the same in the two countries. This means that the direction of trade will be based on supply conditions only, without any effect for demand. Next time, we are going to talk about general equilibrium in case of Heckscher Ohlin model and what are the gain from international trade in this case. Thank you and see you next week.